I never expected betrayal to arrive with such authority, wrapped in the sound of 3 sharp knocks on my own front door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, or maybe a delivery, but when I opened it, I was met with the cold, piercing eyes of my father and the tight-lipped disapproval of my mother. They stood there like strangers, their presence heavy, suffocating the air around me. My father's voice cut through the silence with the precision of a knife. "Pack your things, Ashley. This house belongs to us now." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe he had spoken in anger or jest, but the way his jaw clenched left no room for doubt. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might bruise my ribs. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was war. I leaned against the doorframe, searching their faces for any trace of love or warmth, something to anchor me in this storm. But there was nothing, only that chilling emptiness I remembered from childhood arguments when I'd cry and beg for comfort but find none. My mother avoided my gaze, eyes fixed on the floor as though ashamed, yet her silence confirmed she agreed. My father, on the other hand, thrived in his authority, standing tall, lips curled with a smirk that told me he relished my shock. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he added, as if my whole life's work was just a burden to discard. My hands trembled as I clutched the door, part of me still unable to believe this was real. My parents, my own parents, were trying to take from me the very thing I had sacrificed everything for. The house wasn't just brick and plaster. It was the result of every sleepless night, every second job, every time I went without, so that I could put just a little more aside for the down payment. It was my triumph, my sanctuary, my safe place after years of feeling like I didn't belong. I remembered the first day I held the keys, how I stood in the empty living room and cried, not because the house was large or fancy, but because it was mine. For once in my life, I had built something no one could take away from me, or so I thought. And now, here they were, standing in my doorway, demanding I surrender it as if it were nothing more than a borrowed toy. "Do you even hear yourselves?" I whispered, my voice cracking between disbelief and anger. "This is my home. I paid for every inch of it with my own hands." My father scoffed, waving away my words as though they were the buzzing of a fly. "We gave you life. Everything you have, you owe to us," he said, his tone dripping with the authority of someone who had long believed themselves the master of my fate. My chest burned with rage, but also sorrow. It was one thing to fight strangers, but to stand against your own blood, against the 2 people who were supposed to protect you, was a wound deeper than any blade could cut. My knees threatened to give way, but I forced myself to stand tall, because I knew if I crumbled now, they'd never let me rise again. I glanced at my mother, hoping she might intervene, hoping she would at least acknowledge that what they were doing was cruel. But she remained still, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. A mother's silence, I realized in that moment, could be just as painful as a father's cruelty. I wanted to ask her why she stood beside him, why she allowed this to happen. But I already knew the answer. She always did. She always chose his side, even when his decisions broke me. My father had the voice, the dominance, the fists when needed, and she had the silence. Together, they had created a prison I thought I'd escaped. Now they were trying to drag me back inside. Inside, I could feel a storm raging. Anger, fear, heartbreak. They collided all at once, making it hard to breathe. Part of me wanted to scream, to slam the door in their faces, but another part froze, shackled by years of conditioning to obey. Every fiber of my being wanted to shout that they were monsters, that they had no right, but I knew they would only twist my words, turn them into evidence of my ungratefulness. It had always been their weapon, guilt. They wore it like armor, wielded it like a sword, and every time I thought I had freed myself, they found a way to pull me back under. But not this time. I couldn't let it be this time. My father stepped forward, invading the threshold of my sanctuary, his presence oppressive. "Go pack. We'll give you an hour," he said with finality, as if the matter was already decided. My mother's hand rested lightly on his arm, not to stop him, but to steady him, to make sure he didn't falter in this cruel act. I felt cornered, suffocated, yet a small ember burned within me. Defiance. This house was mine. My name on the deed, my signature on every loan payment, my sweat embedded in the walls. They had no power here, unless I gave it to them. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't have to. I straightened my back, forcing the tremor from my voice, and let my eyes wander to the table inside my living room, where a thick folder sat. To them, it was probably just paperwork, bills, receipts, maybe tax forms, but I knew better. That folder contained everything I needed, every safeguard I had put in place because some part of me had always known my parents might try to steal what I had built. They thought they could corner me, intimidate me into surrender, but they had no idea that I was no longer the scared little girl they raised. I was ready. My hand tightened on the doorknob, and though my body still trembled, my mind began to sharpen, the fog of fear lifting with every passing second. I looked back at my father's arrogant smirk and my mother's complicit silence, and a wave of clarity washed over me. They believed they held the upper hand, that I was moments away from begging or breaking. But what they didn't know, what they could never have anticipated, was that the next move wasn't theirs. It was mine, and it would be one they would never forget. When I closed the door that day, my father's command still echoing through the hallways of my home, memories came flooding back like a cruel tide. It wasn't just the demand to leave that shook me. It was the fact that deep down, I had always expected something like this. Ever since I was a child, I'd been treated as though I were a tenant in their world, never truly a daughter. My earliest memories weren't of warm hugs or bedtime stories, but of silence punctuated by criticism. "You're too loud, Ashley. You'll never amount to anything." Those words followed me like shadows, shaping me into someone who constantly had to prove her worth. I had built this house to be proof that I wasn't the failure they'd always painted me to be, but their attempt to take it proved one thing: no achievement would ever be enough for them. As I sat alone in the living room, my eyes wandered to the walls I had painted myself, each stroke a symbol of independence, but the paint seemed to peel back in my mind, revealing the scenes of my youth, me at 12 years old, holding report cards with perfect grades, hoping for a smile that never came. My father would look at them and grunt, "Do better." My mother would nod silently, not out of pride but agreement that nothing I did was worthy of celebration. It was as if they had conspired from the start to keep me small, to clip my wings before I ever had the chance to fly. And yet, here I was, in a house I had built on my own, still feeling the sting of their disapproval like it was freshly spoken. There had always been an imbalance in our home. My younger brother, Ethan, had been the golden child, the son who could do no wrong. Even when he failed classes, even when he got into trouble, my parents excused it as boys will be boys. When he wrecked the family car at 16, they laughed it off, saying he was just adventurous. But when I so much as misplaced a glass, I was called careless. Ethan was the reason I worked so hard, because I knew if I didn't, I'd vanish under the weight of their favoritism. Yet no matter how hard I pushed myself, the spotlight never shifted. I had to fight for every ounce of recognition, and most of the time, there was none to be found. I remember one winter night when I was 17, staying up late to finish an essay for a scholarship. I sat at the kitchen table, scribbling furiously under the dim light, while Ethan played video games in the living room. My father came in, glanced at me and said, "Why don't you ever relax like your brother? You're too uptight, Ashley." The irony cut deeper than any insult. I wasn't working for myself. I was working for survival, for a chance to escape the very walls of that house. Every achievement, every honor roll, every award was a lifeline I clung to, and yet my parents never saw it. To them, I was a worker bee, not a daughter. That night after they tried to evict me from my own home, I realized their attitude hadn't changed at all. They saw me as a resource, something to be used, not as a human being with dreams and boundaries. It was no surprise then that they thought nothing of trying to take away what I had built. To them, I was still that little girl they could command, still the one who would bend to their will in desperate hope for approval. They didn't realize that those days were gone. The Ashley they had raised through fear and neglect had been replaced by someone who had built her own foundation, literally and figuratively. Still, I couldn't deny the ache in my chest. As much as I wanted to dismiss them as heartless, they were my parents, and part of me still longed for the love I had never received. It was the cruelest part of their neglect, that even after years of rejection, my heart still sought their approval like a thirsty plant reaching for sunlight. That longing made their betrayal hurt all the more, because it wasn't just about the house. It was about years of trying, of giving, of hoping, only to be reminded yet again that in their eyes, I was nothing. And yet something inside me shifted. This time, instead of crumbling, I would use the pain as fuel. I stood from the couch, wiped the tears that had spilled despite my resolve, and walked into my study where the folder lay waiting. My fingers brushed across the cover, and I thought of the countless nights I had pored over contracts, deeds, legal protections, all in preparation for the day someone might try to take what was mine. Call it paranoia, or maybe call it survival. I had been raised to expect betrayal, and so I had armored myself against it. They thought I was defenseless, because they remembered the child who never fought back. What they didn't know was that their neglect had forged me into someone they couldn't control anymore. Looking back, I wondered if that had been their greatest mistake, not realizing that every dismissal, every cruel word, every moment they made me feel small, had built a fire inside me, a fire they had now foolishly stoked into an inferno. I wasn't powerless, I wasn't voiceless, and most of all, I wasn't theirs to command anymore. This house, this life, belonged to me, and no matter how hard they pushed, I wasn't leaving, not without a fight that would finally show them who I had become. The morning after their demand still felt surreal. I woke up with sunlight streaming through the curtains, but it carried no warmth. The echoes of my father's command, "Pack your things," still lingered in my chest like a bruise. For a moment, I wondered if it had been a dream, if perhaps exhaustion had warped reality, but the folder on the desk reminded me otherwise. Inside it were the documents I had prepared meticulously, the ones that proved this house belonged solely to me. My name was etched in bold letters across the deed, a testament to years of sacrifice. They thought I would crumble, but instead, I felt something uncoil inside me. Resolve. I made coffee slowly that morning, letting the bitter steam curl around me as if it could shield me from the storm that awaited. My parents were not people who backed down easily. I knew this from years of experience. Every argument, every disagreement had ended with me swallowing my words to avoid their wrath. But now, things were different. The stakes weren't about curfews or grades. This was about the roof over my head, the sanctuary I had built brick by brick. I could already imagine the look on their faces when they realized I was prepared, when the folder snapped open and shattered their illusion of control. Yet beneath the steel in my spine, my heart carried a weight that refused to let go. As I stirred sugar into my coffee, I remembered my mother's hands braiding my hair when I was very small. Those moments had been rare, but they existed, and they clung to me like fragile threads. Was I wrong to fight back? Was I heartless for wanting to win, even if it meant crushing what little bridge we had left? That question gnawed at me, because for all their cruelty, I still wanted to believe that love existed somewhere in them. But love didn't demand I give up my home. Love didn't look me in the eye and say I didn't belong. I decided then that the confrontation was inevitable, but it would be on my terms. I wouldn't beg, and I wouldn't rage. I would face them with calm strength, the kind that unnerved more than shouting ever could. So I set about preparing my weapons. Not swords or fists, but facts, papers, and a voice that refused to tremble anymore. I pulled out the folder and flipped through the documents, making sure every page was pristine, every signature visible. If they wanted a war, they would find that I had already fortified my defenses long ago. The hours crawled by, but my chest beat with anticipation. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "We'll be there tonight. Be ready." It wasn't a request. It was a command, the same tone I had known since childhood. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering above the screen, itching to reply with something sharp. But instead, I placed the phone down and took a deep breath. Let them come. For once, I wasn't the child trembling in the corner. I was the woman who owned the ground they stood on. As twilight draped itself over the house, I set the dining table as though expecting guests, though no food adorned it. At the center lay the folder, its presence heavier than any meal could be. The silence of the house was thick, almost sacred, and I walked through each room slowly, reminding myself of what was at stake. The walls I had painted, the furniture I had chosen, the floors I had polished, all of it had been mine, paid for with years of sweat. They could take many things from me, but they would not take this. By the time the knock came, firm and unrelenting, my body was ready even if my nerves screamed otherwise. I opened the door to see their faces, my father's eyes sharp with arrogance, my mother's lips pressed into a thin, determined line. For a fleeting moment, I saw not parents, but adversaries. They didn't greet me. They walked past me as though I were already a ghost in my own home. My father dropped into a chair at the table and tapped his hand on the wood. "Let's make this simple, Ashley," he said coldly. "You'll pack your things tonight." I stood there, feeling the weight of their words press against me, but instead of shrinking, I let silence fill the room. Silence had always been their weapon. Now it was mine. Slowly, deliberately, I walked to the folder and placed my hand upon it. The air shifted, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in their eyes. Uncertainty. My voice was calm, steady, almost foreign to me as I said, "Before you order me out of a house you didn't build, perhaps you should take a look at what's inside this folder." My father leaned back in the chair, his eyes narrowing as though the folder were nothing more than a bluff. I had seen that look countless times. When I came home with straight A's, but he said it wasn't enough. When I worked overtime, but he asked why I wasn't doing more. It was the look of a man who believed he always held the upper hand. My mother crossed her arms, her lips curling in disdain, as though she had already dismissed whatever defense I might bring. But when I slid the folder across the table, the sound of paper against wood cut through the silence with a sharpness that made them both pause. I watched their fingers twitch, hesitant, yet hungry to pry open the truth I had hidden inside. For a moment, no one moved. The air between us felt electric, tense, charged with years of unspoken resentment. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced my breath to remain steady, calm, deliberate. They thought I was bluffing, thought I had no fight left in me after years of caving to their demands. But I had been preparing for this confrontation long before they realized what they were capable of. Finally, my father reached forward, flipping the cover open with a snap, his movements impatient, almost careless. But as his eyes landed on the first page, his expression faltered, barely at first, then more visibly, as the seconds dragged on. My mother leaned over to look, her body stiffening as she scanned the document. Her hand rose instinctively to her chest, fingers pressing as though to calm the sudden thudding of her own heart. "What is this?" she asked, her voice losing the icy confidence it had carried just minutes ago. I met her gaze evenly, refusing to flinch. "It's the deed," I said softly but firmly. "This house is in my name. Every brick, every beam, every inch is mine. Paid in full, no debts, no co-signers, just me." I let the weight of my words hang heavy, letting them feel the truth seep into the cracks of their arrogance. The silence that followed was deafening. My father tried to compose himself, clearing his throat and straightening in his seat, but his hands betrayed him, tightening into fists on the table. He had expected resistance, yes, but not this. Never this. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, his voice edged with desperation masquerading as authority. "We're still your parents, and you owe us respect." His words were meant to sting, to remind me of my place in their hierarchy, but I found they no longer pierced me the way they once did. Respect had to be earned, and what they demanded was not respect. It was obedience. "I do respect you," I said quietly, and I saw their eyes flicker in surprise. "I respect the fact that you gave me life, that you clothed me and fed me when I couldn't do it myself. But respect doesn't mean surrendering everything I've built to your whims. Respect doesn't mean giving you the keys to a house you neither paid for nor cared to help me maintain. Respect is mutual, and what you're asking for is theft wrapped in entitlement." My words trembled with suppressed emotion, but they were steady, each syllable deliberate, cutting through years of silence I had once mistaken for peace. My mother's eyes softened for the briefest second, and I caught a glimpse of something, doubt, maybe even guilt, before it vanished behind a mask of bitterness. "Ashley," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you don't understand how much we've sacrificed for you. Everything we did for your future." Her attempt at justification was almost laughable, but it tugged at me nonetheless. Memories surged. The empty fridge, the late-night arguments about money, the way they had always managed to make me feel like a burden even when I was working 2 jobs to contribute. Their sacrifices had always come with strings, and now those strings had tightened into a noose they expected me to wear willingly. I leaned forward, my eyes burning with unshed tears, my voice low but unyielding. "Don't twist this, Mom. You sacrificed when it suited you, but you also demanded more than any child should ever carry. I worked 3 jobs while you watched from the couch. I saved while you borrowed. I built while you tore down. This house isn't your sacrifice. It's mine. Every penny, every hour, every sleepless night is etched into these walls. So no, I won't hand it over. Not to you, not to anyone." The words felt like fire in my throat, scorching but cleansing, stripping me of the guilt they had instilled for so long. My father's face darkened, his pride warring with the reality before him. He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. "You think this makes you untouchable?" he hissed, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You think a piece of paper gives you power over us?" His voice dripped with venom, but I no longer cowered before it. Instead, I felt a strange calm wash over me, a clarity that came from finally standing tall. "No," I replied steadily. "The paper doesn't give me power. The truth does, and you can't erase it, no matter how much you want to." That was the moment I realized the war had truly begun. They had come expecting obedience, expecting me to crumble under the weight of their authority, but they had underestimated me. The folder wasn't just a shield, it was a sword. And though they would fight back with every manipulative tactic they knew, I had finally learned that survival wasn't about silence, it was about standing my ground. As the evening shadows stretched across the room, I felt a shift in the air. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to fight. The tension in the room clung to me like humidity before a storm, suffocating and unrelenting. My father still sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly I could almost hear the grinding of his teeth. My mother, however, had risen to her feet and paced the length of the living room, her heels tapping against the hardwood floor with a rhythm that betrayed her restlessness. Her arms folded across her chest, as though she needed a barrier to protect herself from the truth I had laid bare. For years I had avoided open confrontations with them, believing silence was easier, believing peace was worth my dignity. But now I understood the silence had only allowed their entitlement to grow unchecked, until it consumed every corner of our relationship. "I can't believe you'd do this to us," my mother said suddenly, her voice sharp and brittle. "After everything we gave up, after all the years we carried you." Her words sliced through the air, but I no longer shrank from them. Instead, I lifted my chin, meeting her gaze with a strength that surprised even me. "What exactly did you carry?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "Because from where I stand, I was the one carrying you. I was the one who gave up my childhood to babysit, to work, to pay for things that you were supposed to provide. I was the one who turned my dreams into shifts at dead-end jobs, while you told me it was my duty as your daughter." Her mouth opened, then closed again, as though the words I had thrown at her had stripped her of her usual arsenal of comebacks. My father filled the silence, his voice booming with forced authority. "Don't talk to your mother like that," he barked. "She sacrificed more than you could ever understand. We had to give up opportunities, ambitions, stability, because we had you too young. We could have lived better lives if it weren't for the responsibilities you brought us." His words struck like blows, crueler than he perhaps intended, but I felt each one reverberate deep within me. To him, I had never been a blessing, never a daughter, only a burden. A memory surfaced uninvited, vivid and painful. I was 12, crouched by the fridge, counting coins in my palm to see if I could afford a carton of milk for the week. My mother had been asleep on the couch, exhausted from a night of drinking, while my father had stormed out after another shouting match. I had stood there in that kitchen, small and trembling, believing it was my job to fix everything, to keep the family afloat. That memory, buried for years under layers of excuses and denial, returned with brutal clarity, and I realized just how long they had conditioned me to believe their sacrifices outweighed mine. "You talk about responsibilities as though they were chains you never asked for," I said, my voice breaking but firm. "But I never asked to be born either. I never asked to be the reason you gave up on your dreams. That was your choice, not mine, and you've been punishing me for it every day since. Well, I'm done being punished." My words trembled as they left me, but once they hung in the air, I felt something inside me snap free, a rope loosening from around my chest. For the first time, I was telling them the truth, not for their sake, but for mine. My mother stopped pacing, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, darted away from mine, as though she couldn't bear the weight of what I had said. But my father only grew colder. His face hardened, his expression unreadable, though the veins in his temple pulsed with quiet rage. "Ungrateful," he muttered, shaking his head. "We gave you a roof, we gave you food, we gave you our name, and this is how you repay us? By throwing it back in our faces? By taking what should be ours?" The word ours lingered, heavy and deliberate, as though my bloodline was enough to entitle them to everything I had worked for. "Ours?" I repeated, my voice incredulous. "You didn't build this house. You didn't sit in freezing apartments wondering if the heat would stay on. You didn't eat ramen for months so you could put every dollar into savings. You didn't sit at a desk until 3 in the morning with burning eyes just to finish freelance work on top of your job. This house is not ours. It's mine, because I refuse to let your mistakes define me. The words surged out of me like a flood, unstoppable, carrying years of pain and exhaustion. My chest heaved with the weight of my confession, but it felt good, necessary. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in my father's eyes. It was brief, gone in an instant, but I caught it. The recognition that I was no longer the child they could manipulate. My mother finally sat down again, her shoulders slumped, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, like the truth had deflated her defenses. But my father leaned forward, his voice lower now, more deliberate. You think this is over because you have a deed? You think a piece of paper will protect you from family? No, Ashley. You've started a war, and you're not ready for the consequences. His words hung like a curse, dark and foreboding, promising a storm I hadn't yet imagined. And yet, as I sat across from them, my hand still resting firmly on the folder, I realized something vital. Maybe I wasn't ready for a war. Maybe I wasn't prepared for the backlash that was sure to follow, but I was no longer afraid of it. I had already endured the worst. Years of belittlement, exhaustion, emotional manipulation, and I had survived. Whatever came next, I would face it head on. And for the first time in my life, the thought of fighting back didn't terrify me. It thrilled me. The night after that confrontation, sleep refused to come. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling as the words my father had spoken replayed in a loop. You've started a war. It wasn't just the sound of his voice. It was the certainty with which he had said it, as if he had been planning something long before I even claimed ownership of the house. The silence of the night pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above me. I realized with an uncomfortable twist in my stomach that even though this house was legally mine, its walls were still haunted by their shadows, by the history they refused to release. The next morning, I decided to go through the storage room in the basement, a place I rarely entered. Boxes stacked to the ceiling lined the cramped space, most of them filled with old documents and broken memories I had never dared to examine. Dust clung to my fingertips as I pulled them open, one by one, searching for something I couldn't yet name. Maybe I was looking for clarity, or maybe I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining their malice, that there was something darker lingering beneath their sudden obsession with this house. The air in that basement was stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years, and yet I felt like I was intruding on something that didn't want to be uncovered. I found the first clue in a box labeled tax records. Buried beneath yellowed receipts and faded bills, there was a folder marked with my father's handwriting. The words, property agreements, scrawled across the front immediately caught my attention. My heart quickened as I flipped through the documents, realizing these weren't related to me at all, but to my parents' failed ventures. Multiple foreclosure notices, eviction warnings, even court summons, all evidence of how deeply they had sunk into financial ruin. They had lost more homes than I ever knew they owned, bouncing from one failure to the next, while spinning stories about sacrifice and endurance. It dawned on me that this house wasn't about pride for them. It was about redemption, a last chance to rewrite the narrative of all their losses. As I pieced through the papers, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A letter from a bank dated years before I even began saving for this house. It spoke of fraud investigations, unauthorized loans, and a warning that further action could lead to jail time. My hands trembled as I held it, the weight of the truth settling like lead in my chest. My parents weren't just irresponsible. They were reckless, dangerous, willing to manipulate anyone and anything to maintain a facade of control. And now, I realized, they saw my house not just as property, but as their escape, a shield against the failures and consequences that had haunted them for decades. By the time I climbed back upstairs, the sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the living room walls. I sat at the table, the incriminating folder spread out before me, and for the first time in days, tears burned at the edges of my vision, not just because of their lies, but because of the cruel irony of it all. For years, I had blamed myself for not being enough, for not fixing the family, for not living up to their impossible standards. But the truth was so much darker. They had been drowning long before I was old enough to even understand what drowning meant. And instead of pulling themselves out, they had chained themselves to me, dragging me down with them. The knock on my door startled me. When I opened it, I found my father standing there, his face unreadable, his posture deceptively calm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, almost soothing. But I noticed the way his eyes flicked past me, scanning the hallway as if he already knew what I had discovered. He stepped inside without waiting for my permission, and I could feel the shift in the atmosphere immediately, like the house itself held its breath. My mother followed shortly after, her expression softer than his, almost pleading, but her silence was heavier than words. They sat across from me at the table, and for a moment, it felt like a twisted reenactment of a family dinner we never had. My father folded his hands, leaning forward slightly. "Ashley, you need to understand something," he began, his voice steady. "That house, it isn't just walls and bricks. It represents what we lost, what we deserve to reclaim. You wouldn't even have it if it weren't for the foundation we gave you." My stomach knotted as I realized he wasn't here to apologize or to compromise. He was here to justify, to convince me that taking from me was a correction, a balancing of debts that existed only in their minds. For a brief second, my mother's eyes met mine. I expected anger, bitterness, maybe even coldness, but instead, I saw fear. Not fear of me, but fear of him, fear of what was coming if I didn't bend. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something, but no words came out. My father's hand tightened into a fist on the table, and in that moment, the fragile thread holding us together finally snapped. I wasn't dealing with parents anymore. I was dealing with people who would stop at nothing, who had rewritten reality to justify their destruction. And as I sat there, the folder of their secrets within arm's reach, I realized this war wasn't about to end. It was only beginning. I didn't flinch when I said, "I know everything." My voice was calm, steady, but my heart pounded in my chest. Their faces shifted in unison. His hardened, hers drained of color. Silence stretched between us like a taut rope, seconds dragging out like hours. My father leaned back, his mouth twitching into a cold smile. "Then you know what's at stake," he said softly, "and you'd better be prepared to pay the price." The silence after my father's words was so thick I could almost hear it breathing. I sat there at the table, my palms flat against the wood, fighting the urge to tremble. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to push them out of my house and lock the doors, but something stronger rooted me to that chair, a realization that for the first time in my life, I had leverage. I wasn't the scared little girl they had manipulated with guilt and fear. I had the proof of their corruption, the evidence of their failures, and I could wield it like a weapon if I chose to. It felt terrifying, but also liberating. The chains they had wrapped around me for so long were starting to loosen, link by link. My father leaned forward again, his face hardening, the calm tone in his voice cracking into something sharper. "You think a few old papers change anything?" he sneered. "You don't understand how the world works, Ashley. Family comes first no matter what, and you owe us." His words stung, not because they were true, but because I had once believed them. My mother's eyes darted to the folder on the table, and I noticed how her hands twisted nervously in her lap, betraying the quiet war raging inside her. She wanted to speak, but she was trapped, not only by his presence but by decades of fear and loyalty. I realized then that my battle wasn't just against him. It was against the entire story they had forced her, and me, to live inside. I slid the folder across the table deliberately, letting the documents fan out just enough for both of them to see. "I know about the fraud, the foreclosures, the lies you've hidden," I said, my voice sharp, stronger than I thought I could muster. "This house isn't your redemption. It's your last excuse, and I won't let you take it." The look on my father's face shifted, just slightly, from smug confidence to something closer to rage. He wasn't used to me standing up to him, not like this. My mother's lips parted, and for the first time she whispered, "James, please." Her voice cracked on the last word, a sound so small, yet it reverberated inside me. She was breaking too. Instead of softening, my father slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "You think you can threaten me with this?" he barked, his voice echoing like thunder. "You don't have the courage to destroy your own family. You've always been weak, Ashley. Always." His words landed like blows, designed to cut deep into the scars he had carved long ago. But instead of sinking, I found myself rising. His fury only proved what I already knew, that his control was slipping, that his fear of exposure was greater than his love for me. For the first time, his insults didn't feel like truth. They felt like desperation. I stood slowly, deliberately, my chair scraping against the floor. "I am not weak," I said, each word sharp and deliberate. "You've spent your whole life feeding on fear, but I won't give you mine anymore. You don't own me. You don't own this house. And if you try to take it, I will expose you." My hands shook slightly, but my voice did not. My father's face turned red, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might snap. My mother's eyes widened, tears brimming as she pressed her hands to her mouth. It was as if she was seeing me for the first time, not as their daughter bound to their story, but as a woman who was finally stepping outside of it. He rose to his feet, towering over me, but I didn't step back. His presence, once enough to silence me into submission, felt hollow now. I saw through him, through the lies, the posturing, the cruelty he disguised as authority. For a moment, it was just us, locked in a battle of wills that stretched back years, maybe even decades. I felt my heart pounding, my breath quickening, but I stood firm, knowing that if I faltered now, he would win, and I couldn't let him win. Not this time, not ever again. Then something unexpected happened. My mother stood up too. She moved between us, her hands trembling as she reached toward me, not him. "Ashley, you don't have to do this alone," she said softly, her voice breaking. My father's head whipped toward her, his face a mask of betrayal. "What are you doing?" he snarled. But she didn't look at him. She only looked at me, her tears spilling freely. For so long, she had been his silent accomplice. But in that moment, I saw the faint flicker of resistance, the first cracks in her obedience. It was fragile, but it was there. My father's rage exploded. He shouted, his words slurred with fury, but I barely heard them. All I saw was the woman who had given me life finally reaching for me, even if her hand shook as she did. And in that instant, I realized something profound. The war wasn't just mine anymore. The house wasn't just mine. It was the battlefield where generations of silence, fear, and manipulation were finally unraveling. And for the first time, I felt the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't fighting for myself alone. I was fighting for her too, for both of us. When he stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the walls shook, I stood there with my mother in stunned silence. The air was thick with tension, but also with something new, something that felt almost like hope. She clutched my hand, her grip fragile but steady, as if anchoring herself to the courage she had just borrowed from me. "He won't forgive this," she whispered, her voice raw. "But maybe it's time we stop asking for his forgiveness." Her words echoed inside me like a promise, a fragile light in the dark, and I knew then that the battle wasn't over, but it was changing, and so was I. The night after my father stormed out, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt louder than usual, every shadow heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for what would come next. My mother had fallen asleep in the guest room upstairs, her soft breaths a reminder that she had chosen, for the first time, to step toward me instead of him. That fragile alliance weighed on my heart, like both a blessing and a burden. I knew he wouldn't let this go. My father had never lost a battle in his own mind, and the thought of being exposed would only make him more reckless. I sat at the dining table staring at the folder, knowing it was my sword, but also my shield. And now, I had to decide how to wield it. In the morning, I found my mother sitting quietly at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. Her eyes were swollen, but there was something different in them. Less emptiness, more unease, like she was seeing the cracks in her world for the first time. "He'll come back," she whispered, almost as if confessing. I nodded. "I know," I said. "That's why we need to be ready." I slid the folder toward her, opening it enough for her to see the damning evidence. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Ashley, if this gets out, he'll lose everything." Her words trembled with fear, but I caught the undertone. He deserved it. The decision I made then wasn't one of anger, but of necessity. "Mom, I don't want to destroy him. I just want him to stop, to let me live my life without his shadow." She looked at me with tears streaming down her cheeks, as if the possibility of living without that shadow had never even occurred to her. It broke me inside to realize how long she had been a prisoner of his dominance, how she had shrunk herself so completely that the idea of freedom felt foreign. But now, we both had a choice, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized my counterattack wasn't about revenge, it was about survival. That afternoon, I reached out to Daniel, the lawyer who had helped me during the purchase of the house. He had always been kind, thorough, and firm, someone I knew I could trust. When I explained the situation, his voice sharpened with concern. "Ashley, you're sitting on a legal minefield," he said. "If what you have is real, your father could be charged with fraud, possibly worse. But more importantly, you can use this to secure your claim on the house." My heart pounded as I listened, taking in his plan, feeling both the terror and the thrill of fighting back with tools my father had never expected me to hold. This was no longer just a standoff. It was war. When my father returned 2 days later, his arrogance was intact, but his eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of unease he tried to bury under his rage. He walked in without knocking, his voice booming through the house. "I'll give you one more chance, Ashley. Leave this place, or I'll make you regret ever thinking it was yours." My mother flinched at his words but didn't move from her seat beside me. This time, I didn't back down. I calmly placed the folder on the table, pushed it toward him and said, "I've already spoken to a lawyer. If you push me, this won't stay in this house. It will go to the authorities." His face drained of color, just like I knew it would. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. Not the kind he projected onto others, but the kind that clawed at him from the inside. He tried to mask it with anger, but his words stumbled. "You wouldn't dare," he said, but his voice cracked at the edges. My mother's hand slipped into mine under the table, a quiet act of defiance that nearly undid me. For decades, he had ruled us with control and silence, but now the silence was breaking. I felt the shift in the air, a tide turning, and for once it was in my favor. The argument that followed was a storm. He accused me of betrayal, of disloyalty, of destroying the family. Every accusation was laced with venom meant to weaken me, but instead it revealed his desperation. "You owe me," he shouted. "Everything you have is because of me." I looked at him squarely, feeling the weight of years lifting off my shoulders. "No," I said quietly, but firmly. "Everything I have is despite you." My mother gasped softly, the truth of those words echoing in the room like a verdict. He froze, as if struck by a blow he hadn't seen coming. For once, he had no answer. That night, after he left again, slamming the door in retreat rather than victory, my mother and I sat together in the quiet house. She looked fragile, torn between the man she had lived with and the truth she could no longer ignore. "Ashley," she whispered, "you've done what I never could." Her voice shook with gratitude and sorrow. I reached for her hand and held it tightly. "It's not over yet," I told her, "but we're not powerless anymore." And for the first time in years, I actually believed it. As I climbed into bed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The war was far from over, but I had turned the tide. The chains of silence were cracking, the walls of fear crumbling, and I knew my father was more dangerous now than ever. But so was I, and while part of me still trembled at the thought of the battles to come, another part of me, stronger, steadier, was ready to face him. The girl who had once cowered was gone. In her place stood a woman who was finally learning how to fight. I should have known my father wouldn't retreat quietly. The days that followed his last outburst were deceptively calm, almost eerily so, as though the house itself was holding its breath. But on the fourth morning, I found a letter slipped under my front door, a formal notice claiming that the property belonged to him and my mother, citing parental financial contributions. My hands trembled as I read the cold, calculated words. He was trying to turn the law against me, to paint me as the ungrateful daughter squatting in a home he claimed was his by right. Rage flared in my chest, but underneath it was a current of fear. My father wasn't just fighting with words anymore. He was weaponizing the very system that had once oppressed me. I brought the letter straight to Daniel, my lawyer. He examined it with narrowed eyes and a deep sigh. "This isn't just a bluff," he said. "He's hired an attorney, and they'll try to drag this through court." My stomach sank, but Daniel's voice was steady. "Ashley, don't panic. You have every receipt, every transfer, every deed in your name. They don't stand a chance, unless he lies." The word lies hit me like a stone. If there was one thing my father knew how to do, it was to twist reality until even the truth bent under his weight. Suddenly, this wasn't just about papers. It was about whether I had the strength to hold firm when his storm hit full force. The storm arrived sooner than I expected. My Aunt Clara called me late that night, her voice laced with disappointment. "Ashley, how could you do this to your parents? They're heartbroken. Your father told us you manipulated them, that you tricked them into signing documents they didn't understand. How could you betray the people who raised you?" Her words cut like knives, not because they were true, but because they echoed the story he had woven so carefully. He had poisoned the family against me, turning cousins, uncles, and even old neighbors into skeptics of my character. The isolation was suffocating. For years I had longed to belong, and now, just when I had found my voice, he was trying to strip me of it. My mother, torn between two worlds, became a ghost in the house. She would sit at the edge of the sofa with her hands knotted together, her eyes darting whenever the phone rang. I could tell she was receiving calls, pressure from relatives, and though she didn't say much, her silence spoke volumes. "Maybe if you just gave him something," she murmured once, almost too quietly to hear. My heart broke for her weakness, for the decades of fear that had carved obedience so deeply into her bones. But I shook my head. "No, Mom. Giving in would only feed him. This ends here." She looked at me with a kind of aching admiration and sorrow, like she wished she could borrow my strength but knew she couldn't. Then came the most brutal blow. My employer called me into the office with a grim expression. "Ashley, I hate to say this, but your father reached out. He's been spreading rumors, questioning your integrity, suggesting you've been involved in financial misconduct. We don't believe it, but the board is nervous." My knees nearly gave out. He wasn't just attacking my home anymore. He was going after my livelihood. Everything I had worked for was under siege, all because he couldn't accept losing control over me. The humiliation burned in my veins, but underneath it grew a sharper resolve. If he wanted war, then war was exactly what he would get. That night, I stayed awake at the dining table, the folder spread open before me like a battlefield map. Every document, every record was a weapon. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who cowered under his words, who would have surrendered everything just to keep the peace. But that girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had fought too hard to back down now. I wrote out a plan with Daniel, listing every legal step we'd take, every counter-argument we'd raise. But more than that, I decided I would no longer fight in shadows. If my father wanted to expose me, then I would expose him. The following morning, I called a family meeting. Relatives, neighbors, anyone who had been pulled into his web of lies. My mother sat beside me, trembling but present, as I laid the folder on the table. "You've heard his story," I said, my voice steady though my hands shook. "Now, it's time you hear the truth." Gasps filled the room as I opened the documents, showing them his hidden accounts, the debts he had buried under lies, the fraud he had committed. The air grew thick, heavy with disbelief and anger, not at me, but at him. For once, I wasn't the one on trial. He was, and the more I revealed, the paler my mother grew, as though she were finally seeing the man she had lived with for decades. As the room emptied, whispers trailing into the night, I sat alone in the silence, my heart still racing. This was far from over. I knew my father would come back harder, angrier, more desperate, but the tide had shifted again. For the first time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was exposing the truth, tearing apart the illusions he had built, brick by brick. And as terrifying as it was also liberating. The girl who once trembled at his footsteps now stood at the center of the storm, unbroken, unyielding, and ready for the final battle that was yet to come. The morning of the final confrontation arrived like a storm, gray clouds pressing down as if the sky itself knew what was about to happen. I walked into the courtroom with my mother beside me, her hand trembling in mine, a fragile yet steady anchor. My father's eyes were dark with fury, his lawyer's stiff posture a thin shield against the truth that was about to unravel. The gallery was full of relatives, neighbors, and even a few of my father's old business associates, all buzzing with anticipation. I could feel every heartbeat, every whispered expectation, but I refused to falter. Today, I wasn't just fighting for a house or validation. I was reclaiming my life from the shadow he had cast over me for decades. As the proceedings began, my father's lawyer tried to spin the story, painting me as greedy, dishonest, ungrateful, a daughter attempting to manipulate her own family. I listened silently, letting each accusation land but refusing to flinch. When it was my turn, I stepped forward, opened the folder, and laid out every piece of evidence: bank transfers, hidden accounts, legal documents, photographs of fraud schemes, and letters that proved intentional deception. Each paper felt heavier than the last, but also like a brick, tearing down the walls he had built around us. The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the stark truth that could no longer be denied. My father's face twisted from arrogance to shock, and then to pale, hollow disbelief. You can't. "This isn't how it works," he stammered, as though reality itself had betrayed him. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. The evidence spoke for itself. Every lie and manipulation laid bare in the daylight for the first time. My mother's eyes glistened with tears, but I could see a faint spark of pride. For the first time, she wasn't the frightened woman cowering under his shadow. She was a witness to the daughter she had helped raise, strong, unyielding, and finally free. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I held up a letter I had intercepted weeks ago, one that detailed his intentions to forge documents and manipulate the courts further. "This," I said, my voice echoing across the room, "is the plan my father thought I would never find. He believed fear would keep me silent. He believed loyalty would bind me to his lies, but I have chosen truth over fear, and justice over silence." A murmur ran through the courtroom, some incredulous, some relieved. I could feel the power shifting with every word, the balance tilting so sharply in my favor that my father could no longer hide behind anger or intimidation. The judge leaned forward, peering over his glasses, his voice steady but commanding. "Mr. Whitman, you are aware of the evidence presented. You have the opportunity to respond truthfully. Do you deny any of these claims?" My father opened his mouth, then closed it, as though the words were swallowed by the weight of his own guilt. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with anticipation, until finally he whispered, almost inaudibly, I, but no continuation came. Silence stretched long enough for every person in the room to feel the magnitude of his surrender. He had been exposed completely, his power stripped bare, and for the first time in decades, the truth prevailed. My mother leaned closer, her hand tightening around mine. "Ashley," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe and sorrow. You did it." I swallowed hard, fighting the lump in my throat. "We did it, Mom. Together. He can't hurt us anymore. Not with lies. Not with fear. Not with manipulation. This is over." For the first time, I felt a true sense of closure, as though the long nightmare of intimidation and control had lifted in a single surreal moment. My father slumped in his seat, defeated, powerless, and the courtroom breathed a collective sigh, like a city exhaling after a storm. As we left the courtroom, the weight on my shoulders seemed lighter than it had in years. My mother's arm brushed mine, and I realized we weren't just survivors. We were victors. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, sunlight scattering across the marble steps, casting long golden streaks. I inhaled the crisp air, tasting freedom, tasting vindication. I realized that in standing up, in refusing to bow, I hadn't just saved a house. I had reclaimed my family, my dignity, and most importantly, my life. My father would recover from this, but he would never again wield the fear that had once controlled us. That night, back in my home, I sat with my mother in the quiet living room, the folder now neatly stacked on the coffee table, a testament to the battle we had endured. "Ashley," she murmured, "I never thought I'd see the day you would stand up like this. You've changed everything." I smiled faintly, exhausted but exhilarated. "It's not just me, Mom. It's us. We broke the cycle today, and we'll never let it start again." The house felt different somehow, lighter, safer, alive. The echoes of my father's tyranny were fading into memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of truth, courage, and love finally prevailing. And as I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, a sense of peace settled over me. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I also knew something unshakable had been forged in the fire of this conflict. My voice, my courage, my unbreakable will. I was no longer a daughter under his shadow. I was Ashley, the woman who had reclaimed her life and stood unwavering in the face of betrayal. For anyone listening to this story, remember this: courage is forged in confrontation, truth is powerful, and standing up for yourself can change everything. If you found strength in my story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, because there are more battles, more victories, and more lessons waiting to inspire you.